Welcome to the Sony A7R review with Canon EF lenses. When the Sony A7R first shipped, I was one of the first customers to buy one, and I was pretty excited for a number of different reasons. And ever since I got it, a lot of photographers have been asking me how my experience with this camera is, what the details are, how it performs, all this stuff. And I'm in the process of writing a review, but I thought I would do something a little bit different this time and just sort of stream of consciousness, lay down my thoughts on a blog page and on this video of what it's like leading up to that review. So this is just sort of a raw, stream of consciousness dump, so to speak, of what it's like to use this camera in the field, and these video clips are more or less just hacked together, not too much editing going on here. So in this review, we're going to take a look at my experience with this camera in the field, what it's like to use it for the first time, how it compares with other digital SLRs in this range, and all of that. Let's take a look at some of the Sony A7R's key features. The first key feature is that the Sony A7R is currently the lightest full-frame camera on the market. It's also the smallest full-frame camera on the market, which makes the Sony A7R the lightest and smallest full-frame camera on the market. Pretty big deal for people who are looking to shed weight but also keep that really high image quality. The next key feature is Sony's 36 megapixel 35mm sized sensor, which does not have an optical low pass filter. So definitely an advantage for still shooters and definitely an advantage for landscape photographers. The next key feature is the 3-inch high resolution LCD. Has a bit more resolution than some of the other competitors in this range, but more or less the same. The next key feature is the Sony A7R's image processor, which nobody can pronounce. Now, the Sony A7R shoots 1080p video with 60 FPS, and it also captures in Sony's native AVCHD file format, which is sure to be really popular with DSLR filmmakers and cinematographers. The ISO range of Sony A7R is 50 to 25,600, and the Sony A7R has integrated Wi-Fi. So I just inserted the Metabones Adapter onto the Sony A7R, and I put on the 40mm 2.8 Canon pancake lens, and as you can see, it's pretty darn small, and the actual EF adapter is actually slightly larger than the 42.8. So if you own a 42.8, then you hold that in your hand, and that's about what the Metabones Adapter weighs, a little bit more actually. The construction quality of the Metabones Adapter looks pretty darn good. It is pretty heavy, but then again, to support bigger lenses, I think that's probably necessary. I think the trade-off is probably worth it for shooters that have very long lenses, and especially people who have 2.8L lenses. So I think the quality is pretty darn good. Now, with this Metabones Adapter on it, it has a nice weight to it. It still feels lighter than the 6D, and actually the size of it is so tiny. In fact, it just feels kind of like a point and shoot. Although the quality is noticeably better. So the body here is magnesium alloy and pretty well made. Construction quality here is really, really high, so that's pretty nice. So overall, with the Canon 42.8 with the EF adapter, this thing is pretty darn small, which is pretty nice. One of the cool things about the Sony A7R's video capture mode is that it captures video in a 60 frames per second format. So this is definitely an advantage for DSLR filmmakers and cinematographers who want additional creative control over the video end of things. In addition to capturing video at 60 frames per second, the Sony A7R also captures in the AVCHD file format. And applications such as Final Cut Pro 10 automatically convert that AVCHD file format into something that can be understandable by Final Cut, such as ProRes. One of the things that kind of surprised me was the stereo mic quality from the A7R directly in camera. It's pretty darn good, and it's significantly better than any of the other DSLRs I've ever used for audio.
I really like the small size, and the small size for me is really kind of cool. And it's not like a defining factor for buying the thing. That's just out of the question. Nobody would buy a camera just for the small size. But if the image quality is actually better, and I've yet to actually confirm that in my own test, then having a small body with better image quality is a good thing. So, you know, that's kind of the angle that I'm approaching this from, is that if this thing does produce significantly better image quality and it's actually smaller, you know, then this is a pretty cool thing for landscape photographers. One of the things I really like about this Sony is that it's really, really well designed from an industrial design standpoint. And, you know, it kind of feels like the Sony design team spent like a few weeks or a few months in like a room full of 35mm rangefinder cameras and just sort of pulled design cues off of them and incorporated it into this beautiful camera. And it is beautiful in terms of, you know, just simple industrial design. Like, for example, this little, you know, exposure compensation dial really reminds me of something that you'd find on one of those old rangefinder cameras. You know, this little mark here on the left side, which kind of doesn't do anything for you, but, you know, you don't see those on digital cameras, but you do on these old rangefinders. So that's kind of cool. Just kind of a nice little accent. And notice just the clean lines over here, just nothing going on. I don't like the menu button over here that's justified to the left, away from all this other stuff, but, you know, that's a digital camera thing. You know, this little pentaprism-like box here also kind of looks like a little rangefinder pentaprism box. So just overall, the thing's really well designed, but it has these beautiful digital features, like this little tiny record button located over here, which I just love. That's just such an awesome place to put that thing. You know, out of the way, but also just nice and classic and clean looking. Sony really put some thought into the menu system on this thing. Now, I've never seen a camera that the menu system is just like, you look at it and you're just like, wow, this thing's well laid out, it's designed for humans, you know, makes a lot of sense. I haven't actually seen one of those, but this one's pretty darn good. I mean, in the scale of like, you know, user experience in software, it's pretty darn bad. But then again, the others are just even worse. So I'd say that they're heading in the right direction here, and, you know, I would assume that this comes from their downstream, you know, technology and experience with other, you know, kinds of stuff that they produce, like TVs and game consoles and, you know, all this kind of stuff. So definitely an advantage here, you know, with this little guy, especially because you are kind of locked into a menu system just for getting around the camera, because it is, you know, live view centric camera. So that is something that I really like. Now, these little tiny, the thumb wheel, the thumb wheel back here, the index finger wheel in the front, and this exposure compensation dial are really, really nice. They have really nice clicks to them. They have really well-defined clicks. The dampening is really nice. In fact, the dampening on this guy, the exposure compensation dial, is, I'd say, like 2 to 3 times greater than the dampening on the index and the thumb wheel. You know, Sony did that intentionally, most likely, because it is located on the edge of the camera, and you might be able to bump it somehow. I don't know. I find it kind of hard to bump because I'm not, you know, fingers just don't tend to gravitate towards that area of the camera unless you actually need to. So I don't see it as being an issue, even if the dampening was less. But it's nice to know that, you know, or at least it seems like the Sony, you know, user experience team did think about that. They didn't just not think about that, so that's definitely cool to know that there's people thinking about other people's experience with their products. That's something that a lot of camera manufacturers just completely ignore. So that's kind of nice. When in live view, it actually, there's some lag in the playback of just composing a scene. So for example, if I'm composing a scene, I actually see like it's dropping down to like 10 or 15 frames per second. It's not at its fluid 30 or 60. I'm not sure what it runs at by default. I would imagine 60. But for some reason, it's almost like the processor can't keep up with the display. So what I'm seeing here is that it's all jittery on the playback just when I'm composing this. And I am maxing it out at ISO 25,600, I believe. At least that's what it looks like on the viewfinder here, or on the LCD. So that could be one reason. Not quite sure about what's going on there. Now, one of the really huge benefits of the Digic 5 Plus processor found on the 5 5D Mark III and the Canon 6D is the ISO range goes from H1 and H2 all the way up to 102,000, I think. And 102,000 is utterly useless to shoot on, of course. I mean, you'd never want to shoot on an ISO that high, but what it translates into is much, much better compositions in live view on a Canon. Because if the live view setting is not set for simulation mode is a feature that allows you to, based on the aperture and based on the shutter speed that you've entered into the camera, it'll attempt to simulate what it will look like. Okay, with that turned off, what the camera does is that it defaults to the highest ISO appropriate to meet your given scene. So for example, in really low light, or in situations where you're using an ND filter, you look through the viewfinder on a Canon, it's impossible to see because it's nearly dark, but live view renders that very bright. And although the quality is really low because you're using ISO all the way up to 100,000, it's pretty bad quality, but the purpose of that is just to compose it. So it renders a completely dark viewfinder really bright. Now, if it's about 5:30 or 6 o'clock and the sun is below the horizon like it is right now, ISO 102,000 is probably sufficient. Now, if you were to drop that down from ISO 102,000 on a Canon down to 25,600, you would see that the live view is almost completely dark, completely black, which doesn't allow you to compose, unfortunately. And a 25,600 is unfortunately the maximum on the Sony A7R. And because you are forced to compose on the live view, I see that as a pretty big downside. So I still haven't played around with it too much yet, but that is one thing that I'm noticing here, is that the LCD is pretty darn dark and it can't get any brighter because it is limited by that ISO 25,000 as the highest that it can go. So one of the things I noticed first when composing at night and taking long exposures is the LCD, when you expose, it goes black. Now, it doesn't go black like turning off black. Actually, the LCD is powering black pixels. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with this, aside from the fact that the pixels aren't off, so they are drawing power. And this guy has a really big tendency to run through batteries fast, obviously, because it's using the live view, and you can't look through an optical viewfinder. So that is one thing that I wonder if Sony even thought about that. Trying to think about, well, I wonder if we're going to make this actually turn off while it's composing and have an indicator light somewhere. Nevertheless, it is drawing power, and you can probably see that here in this video where it's exposing. It might be nice just to turn that thing off, or have some kind of indicator here that's saying, hey, you're doing something. You are actually exposing, as opposed to just having a black screen, which in the daytime looks like it's turned off. If you have like a 10-stop ND filter on the front there. So kind of a downside in my opinion, but again, it's super, super minor. But more importantly, I'm just wondering, did Sony even think about that? I would have to think that they did, and they must have some reason that I'm just not picking up. Sony allows you to really customize the back buttons in a very comprehensive way. And the trash button doubles as a custom button when you're not in playback mode. What an awesome idea. Don't know why other camera manufacturers haven't done that already, but it makes perfect sense. So now the trash button is C3. C stands for custom, there's C1, 2, 3. C1's on the top, C2's right here, C3's down here. So you can customize these three to basically be, whatever you want. And you can go pretty far in customization, which is really, really nice. And I haven't gotten, handle on that. I still don't have those down to like second nature yet, but I'm working on it. But I can tell that using the camera enough, if I have these custom functions dialed in just the way that I want, I can see them really becoming useful. So one of the things I really like about this, though, is that on the Canon and the Nikons, I constantly have to, except for, the exception of some very specific models, cover the viewfinder with like a lens cloth or like my glove, and have the camera strap hold it, just sort of like gravity. But with this, you don't have to worry about that. There's no light leak through the viewfinder like on the Canon 5D Mark III, 6D, all those kinds of cameras. Nice, looks pretty decent. It's definitely not amazing, but looks okay. So I'm gonna zoom in here, see what my sharpness looks like. light. Looks pretty sharp. This is a pretty nice, pretty sharp image. Yeah, nice. That's one nice thing about this, is that this camera is incredibly sharp. And I'm getting the power lines, or not the power lines, but the bridge lines that hold the bridge up in sharp focus as well. So I'm having to push the shutter release and then push the timer on my watch, because this little guy that Sony makes for you know, $2.37, they sell it for $70, doesn't have an intervalometer or anything. Just a basic shutter release for $70. Pretty dumb. The whole battery life situation of this camera is something that does concern me a little bit, because the battery life doesn't really last that long. You know, somebody told me when they were using it that it lasted like 300 shots or something. And I think that's probably pretty true, 300 shots. Actually, I got significantly less, but I was doing, you know, a lot of night stuff and low light, long exposures. But yeah, I mean, normal shooting, I'd say between 300, 400 seems about normal, but I still have to, you know, do a lot of tests. But that seems in the right ballpark, and that sucks. That's not good at all, actually. I mean, considering that the, you know, Nikons and Canons just get ridiculously awesome battery life, assuming you're not on live view the whole time. You know, and this guy is not only is the you know, battery significantly smaller and has less capacity, but you are focused on live view the whole time. You know, and it's also powering a really high resolution display, and it has like 1.2 million pixels on the back. So, you know, there's a lot of things going on here with this camera where, you know, the battery life's just being sucked from it pretty fast.
Okay, so let's do a quick overview here of this Sony A7R review, first impressions from the field. To start it out, this Sony A7R has really high quality construction, and one of the first things you notice when you get your hands on it is how well it's made and how durable it feels. And then, you know, so aside from just being really high quality, it's designed really well. You can tell Sony designers and engineers spent some time on this thing to understand really what it was that photographers needed, what they didn't need. It kind of felt like they really went sort of like back to the drawing board a little bit, which is nice. The body's very small, again, huge benefit for some people. Another benefit here is the image quality, and again, I'm doing an extensive side-by-side to really understand how good the image quality is, and if it is better, how much better. But at first glance, image quality is very high on this camera. One of the big downsides here is that the frames per second on the display drops down to something that is nearly unmanageable when composing, and it drops down to, I would say, between 5, 10, maybe 15 frames per second from the typical 60 that you see on playback. Because you are forced into a live view on this camera, that is a downside when you're in low light situations and when that high ISO is used. Not sure why this is. I'll have to take another look at that and have a better answer in my final review. The AF on this camera is sluggish. Now, if you're used to using a SLR, this is one thing that you'll notice right off the bat, that the autofocus is sluggish. Even with Sony lenses that I've tried, it's still sluggish. And the Canon lenses, you know, the autofocus performs as it does on a Canon camera in live view. That is to say, it's pretty slow in terms of autofocusing. However, you know, with that said, one of the big advantages of this camera is focus peaking. So for those who like to manually focus or have manually focus only lenses, focus peaking is kind of a way to get around that, but it's definitely not a replacement. So another downside here is the ISO on this camera maxes out at 25,600. Now, as I mentioned in the video, you'd never shoot on that with still. However, because you are utilizing the ISO just for the purpose of composing, even if you're using lower ISOs, that is kind of a downside. So I see that as sort of like an upper sort of limit on what this camera can do. ISO 25,600, not so good. In addition to that, the battery life on this camera is subpar. You know, batteries are fortunately very cheap, so that's definitely a good thing. However, on the other hand, these batteries have very, very low capacity, and because the camera is forced into live view 100% of the time, it does run through them pretty quickly. Click here to read the Sony A7R Field Notes with Canon EF Lenses article that I'm writing, and this is sort of the place where you can go and check all of the thoughts and experiences that I'm having with this camera in sort of like a live updated fashion. And then if you're interested in taking a look at, quite a few files at actual size to really get a sense for how this camera performs, click here to view and download over 10 gigabytes of raw, TIFF, MP4, and AVCHD Sony A7R files. And I'm always adding a lot more. So take a look at that. They're all free, and you can download them all. No watermarks, nothing like that. So if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you found this sort of stream of consciousness Sony A7R review first impressions with Canon EF lenses useful. It's my first time doing a format kind of like this. So if you found it useful, let me know by adding a comment down below. If you didn't find it useful, let me know too. Also, like I mentioned, I'm in the process of creating an amazing review of the Sony A7R, trying to get my hands on the whole thing and present you with something amazing. So if you have any questions that I didn't address here in this initial review, please let me know by adding a comment down below, clicking enter, so I can know what those are, so I can make sure to include that in the final review. So thank you so much for watching. Visit www.breakthrough.photography for more great content, and see you next time.